So welcome, Brian. Maybe first introduce yourself. What is your role inside Microsoft?
Okay, so my name is Brian Keller, and I'm a technical evangelist for Visual Studio Application Lifecycle Management, which is kind of a fancy way of saying it's the tools that we build to help software developers, architects, testers, project managers, business analysts all kind of work together. So lately I've been focused on the new set of testing tools that we have in Visual Studio 2010, and so that's why I'm here at the luxurious set we have here at Tech Ed Europe.
Okay.
We just finished my first
And
talk.
did you always work in that topic, or did you have some other jobs within Microsoft before you could?
Yeah, so I've been all over. My very first job at Microsoft, I was the J# product manager. Do you remember J#?
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that didn't last long.
No, it didn't.
So started off as J#, and then I spent some time working on Visual Studio Express, actually. So Dan Fernandez and I.
Yeah, you were really going for it with the Express.
That's right. So making the first free version of Visual Studio available for hobbyists and students and what have you. And after that, I worked on the XNA team for about a year. So I was the original XNA product manager, and then came over to the role that I'm in now, where I focus on helping teams build great software.
Okay, so within application lifecycle management, there's a lot of focus on testing and how do you test your application and make sure your quality is up to speed. Could you tell us something about test-driven development? Because most of the time when I hear you speak or I hear something from Microsoft, it's about you write your code and then you try and test that code. But is there a way to write your tests first and then generate code or something like that?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I think the way most people think of test-driven development is by writing a test so that something fails. So you say, you know, if I call this method, it should return this value. But if you haven't written the code for that particular method yet, your test is going to fail. And so once you know you have the test right, then you can write your code until the test actually passes. And if you've written your test right, then you should then know that, okay, I've implemented this piece of functionality. So that's one way to actually do testing, and that's something that we've supported in our tool set with Visual Studio for unit testing and code coverage and what have you. What we're doing in 2010 is kind of a little bit higher level than that. So the idea is that you have a lot of people that are doing manual testing, and as I mentioned here this week, about 70% of testing that takes place
is still manual.
Still manual testing.
And will it stay manual, or do you think it will transition into more and more automated testing?
Well, I mean, I think all the time we're coming out with better ways of doing automated testing tools, but I think that forever there will still be a need to have manual testing, because automation is going to be more expensive than writing a manual test. For rewriting a manual test, it's usually updating, you know, a text document that says, hey, click here instead of there, because the developer just changed something, right? And so in order for us to be agile and for us to really be able to test quickly, we're going to need to have manual tests. And so that's a big focus for us in 2010.
If you would start a project right now from scratch, something new, what approach would you take? Would you take test-driven development? Would you write your code first? Or would you just use something else like code contracts, for example? Because that's kind of fits together with testing. If you write good contracts, then your tests could be automated, or just I'm just thinking that you could generate your tests from the contracts.
Right. I mean, code contracts and even taking a test-driven approach, those are all forms of writing requirements. And so I think that lends itself well to certain types of development. Certainly, if you're writing, you know, a systems library that doesn't necessarily have a user interface, usually writing a manual test for that doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you're writing a web application or a Windows Forms application that has a very graphical surface, then writing a test case where a manual tester sits there and says, not only does this return the right value, but it's formatted correctly. That's something that's much harder to write an automated test for. And so that lends itself towards starting with requirements, having the manual test cases fall out of that, and having people run those test cases. So I think the answer is that it depends. It depends on what type of project.
It depends on the project, okay. And then Microsoft is really pushing the new Visual Studio 2010 to have a lot of testing capabilities and really focus on Team Foundation and stuff. But I'm wondering, within Microsoft, how do you know about product groups that are actually using Team Foundation Server 2010 already? And like, could you say Office is using it, or those teams are using your own software?
Yeah, absolutely. So the latest numbers that I saw, there's about 20,000 people at Microsoft that use Team Foundation Server to do their jobs. The group, of course, that I'm most familiar with is the developer division. So my division that builds Visual Studio, .NET Framework.
So you use Visual Studio testing to test Visual Studio?
Absolutely. Okay. Absolutely. And so we use Team Foundation Server, have about 3,000 people using Team Foundation Server day in, day out. Interesting story about Windows and Office. Windows 7 and Office 2010 actually adopted TFS 2010 a few years ago, before it was even TFS 2010, to do all of their work item tracking. And so Steven Sinofsky, for example, he can look at a requirement that he's interested in. That information pulls from Team Foundation Server, and he can drill into that using our
view reports and stuff, and know how the project is coming along.
Yeah, like how much of the code has been written, how are the tests passing or not, and so really understand that rich data. Now, on that same note, Windows and Office are not using TFS for source control. There's a lot of legacy there. There's a lot of custom tools.
Yeah, it must be hard to migrate. I think that one of the biggest customers to actually migrate to the new stuff.
Exactly. But the nice thing is that we have tools, and we make those tools available if teams want to adopt in piecemeal and then synchronize that information back and forth, so that part of the team can be using this system and part of the team can be using that system, and they can still share the same information.
And I have one last small question. In the demo you gave, I saw you entering some illegal data for fields, like you need a number here and you enter a negative number, or A or B.
Yep.
And then got me thinking about PEX automation.
Yeah.
Is there a way to let PEX figure out those numbers already, or is it something you're looking at to integrate? Or
that we haven't yet, as far as I know. I'm sure Pelly is working on it. Pelly is always coming up with really interesting ways of using PEX, and that's a conversation that I've been meaning to have with him for a while. But you're right, it would be great if we could data drive our coded UI tests.
If you could see the type of the field, for example, this is a number type, and just fill in some boundaries.
Absolutely, I think that's a great idea.
Okay, so thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
Thank you, and see you on Channel 9.
Sounds good.